selected the subject of this talk as higher command in war, I do address you with a certain amount of diffidence. Because command is an intensely personal affair. And anyone who's exercised it and then goes on to talk about it, which may not be very wise, is bound to do so having based all that he says on his own personal experience. And any man's personal experience, however wide it's been, is limited. And another thing which makes, I think, talks on command, from us old generals, sometimes rather bore, is that we're frightfully inclined to sprinkle our talk with a number of capital I's. And the capital I is not really a very elegant letter. Well, I'll try not to, but I probably shall. The sort of command that I'm talking about, mainly, is higher command. That is the command of an army or an army group or something like that. But most of the things I think I say go for command at almost any level. And if when I've finished, any of you care to get up and say, well, we know a better way to do it, I won't contradict you at all. So long as you say, I know a better way for me to do it, but not necessarily for you. Because I do emphasize right throughout that command is a personal thing. Now, I've been very lucky in my military career, very much more lucky than I deserve. And I've commanded everything from a section of 6 men as a lance corporal to an army group of 1.25 million. And the conclusion I've come to, having done 40 years doing that, is that command, on whatever level you exercise it, is very much the same thing, and it is based on the same qualities. Now, command is that mixture of example, persuasion, and compulsion by which you get men to do what you want them to do, even if they don't want to do it themselves. And if you ask me really to define it, I should say command is the extension of personality. And like all true art, and command is an art, it's exercised by each man in his own way. But you cannot be a commander without having certain qualities. And in command itself, I think there are 3 elements. I'm talking now, remember, of the command of a big organization. There's first of all the commander himself. And then there's his headquarters and his staff. And thirdly, there is the way he keeps contact with the people he commands. And if you'll allow me for a few minutes, I'll talk about each of those. Oh, there's a clock. I like to keep an eye on it. So do you, I expect. Now, if you're ever starting to organize a command and a campaign, and quite a lot of you will probably before you've finished, believe me, the first thing to do is to select your commander and select him early on, because he should be the mainspring of the whole thing. And I said just now that command was the extension of personality. Well, it's no good trying to extend something if you haven't got it. And so if you start off to be a commander, you've got to have a personality. And it's a question of what sort of a personality a commander ought to have. Well, he ought to have a whole lot of qualities. But there are certain ones that are basic, and without which he will never be a commander at all, and which he must have if he is going to be a commander of effect. Now, the first of these is willpower, or determination, if you like to call it that. Because not only does the commander have to decide what is going to be done, that is perhaps one of the easier things, but he's got to see that it is done. And I don't think you really need me to tell you, because most of you have had experience of command on some level. You don't need me to tell you the amount of opposition that will come to everything you want to do. There will be opposition, first of all, from the enemy. Well, that's fair enough. That is the attitude you expect of the enemy. I can remember in the First World War, when I was a very young officer, some bloody fellow at the back started sending up forms to be filled in. And one of the things you had to fill in on the form was the attitude of the enemy. Well, a certain young officer filled in hostile. And he got it back with a very rude note from the staff saying, amplify your answer. And so he sent it back definitely hostile. But the opposition that you will meet from the enemy is, as I say, fair enough. But there are lots of other things, lots of other people who are going to oppose you. And strangely enough, first of all, will be your own staff. Sometimes I used to get so cross with my staff, which was one of the finest Anglo-American staffs you could have had in the world. I used to get so cross with them sometimes that I used to say, you fellows do nothing but tell me that anything I want to do is logistically impossible. And you will get most of your opposition to the things you want to do from the administrative, or what you call the logistical staff. And that is very understandable, because the one thing that an administrative staff officer wants to avoid is letting down his commander. And so they're always a little bit on the cautious side. You know, they used to say that if the British Army ran the Air Force, we should have a captive balloon with 6 spare pilots stowed behind every airplane. Well, I don't think we're quite as bad as that, but there is always a tendency on the part of your administrative staff to say, look here, you're taking too great a risk. Sometimes you may be, but you will get opposition from them. And then there are your subordinate commanders, who probably want to do the thing a little bit differently, or have other ideas. And sometimes you'll find your superiors have very strong ideas of their own, and you will have to deal with that sort of opposition. And then, if you get rather high up, there are doubting and interfering politicians, and you'll have to deal with them. And they aren't so hard to deal with when you get down to it. They aren't half as tough as they look sometimes. And then, of course, there are your allies. Now, it's an extraordinary thing that you should meet with so much opposition from allies. Allies altogether are really very extraordinary people. It's astonishing, you know, how obstinate they are, how parochially minded, how ridiculously sensitive to prestige, how wrapped up in obsolete political ideas. And it's equally astonishing how they fail to see how broad-minded you are. How clear is your picture, how up-to-date you are, and how cooperative, and how big-hearted you are. It's extraordinary. But let me tell you, when you feel like that about allies, and you'll have even worse allies than the British, believe me, when you feel like that about it, just remind yourself of two things. And the first is that you're an ally too, and all allies look just the same. And if you walk around the other side of the table, you'll look just like that to the fellow sitting opposite. And then the next thing to remember is this, that there's only one thing worse than having allies, and that's not to have allies. But you will get opposition from all those sources, and you have simply got to drive through what you want against every kind of opposition, including the opposition of nature. And the opposition of nature can be, of course, the worst of the lot. The British Army fights all its battles uphill, and usually on the junction of 4 map sheets. That's my experience. But to be a little more serious, this determination, this willpower, which is the first essential of a commander, is really based on courage. Not so much on physical courage. You'll have that, because, thank God, we come of races in which courage is bred in us. You will have physical courage, but what as commanders you will have to have is the rarer virtue of moral courage, which simply means that you do what you think is right without bothering too much about the effect on yourself. And that is the courage that you will have to have, and you will have to be as big as your job. And when I say you've got to be as big as your job, there's only one thing that means. That means that you mustn't be too afraid of losing it. It doesn't matter what your job is, whether you're the Supreme Commander or the Lance Corporal. You mustn't be too afraid of losing it. Some people are. But there is one quality no leader can do without, and that's determination. Then, I would put next, judgment. The prime task of the commander is to make decisions. What he's got to do is to weigh up all the various factors, recognizing the fact that you always will in war, that half your information may be wrong, a lot of it is missing completely, and there are all sorts of factors over which you have no control, like the weather and to a certain extent the action of the enemy. But you have got to weigh all those things up and come to a decision as to what you want to do. You must have that judgment of events. And then another kind of judgment that you've got to have is the frightfully important judgment of men. You must be able to select your own subordinates. And I have known at least one man who had every attribute of a commander and would have been one of the greatest commanders that we have produced, but he lacked the power properly to select his subordinates. And he was too loyal to them sometimes and clung on to them when he should have got rid of them. But what you've got to do is to choose your subordinates and then decentralize to them. Don't try and do every goddamn thing yourself, because you'll kill yourself unless you make somebody so angry that he shoots you. And one of the mottos for a commander who is going to survive the strain of command for any length of time, I would say, is don't keep dogs and bark yourself. Deal yourself only with the things that matter, and have the judgment to know which they are. When I commanded things, I had a sort of motto that I went on. No details, no paper, and no regrets. No details. Don't have people coming to you with huge, great files telling you all about it. Make the man explain it. And if he can't explain it, get somebody who can. Don't go about fighting machine guns on different sides of bushes. That's a damn sight better done by a platoon commander. No detail. Then no paper. Well, you can't entirely do without paper, but you can get rid of a lot of it. Quite a lot of it. And when I say no regrets, that is rather important. You do the best you can. You may have got it wrong. You may have lost a battle. You may even have lost a good many of your men's lives, which hurts more. But don't have regrets. Don't sit in the corner and say, oh my God, if I'd only gone to the left instead of the right. Or, oh my God, if I'd only fought in front of the river instead of behind it, or something like that. You've done the best you could. It hasn't come off. All right. What's the next problem? Get on with that. Don't sit in the corner weeping about what you might have done. No details, no paper, no regrets. And if you go on that, and you combine it as I did, with going to bed at 10 o'clock every night, and getting up at 6, and crucifying anybody who woke you up between those hours, unless it was a major disaster, you'll probably survive 5 years of higher command in war like I did. And you'll probably do better, too. Now, in some commanders, the instinct to judge correctly seems instinctive. And you very often hear people say, so-and-so's a lucky commander. Well, you can be lucky once, you can be lucky twice, but I don't think you'll be lucky 3 times. If a chap's lucky 3 times, there's something more to it. And I think I can illustrate that to you. I was once having my portrait painted by a very well-known artist. I wasn't paying him for it, the government was doing that. And I watched him doing it, and he had a big palette. And he took his colors in these little toothpaste tubes, and he squeezed out blobs of the primary colors all down the side of his palette. And then he took a brush, and he took a little dab of each, mixed them all together, and then he went straight on and put his stroke on the canvas, the color of my nose, or whatever it was. And it struck me as the most extraordinary thing, because if I'd been doing that, I should have wanted to try it on a bit of something first and see if I'd got the right color. And I asked him how he did it. And he said, quite frankly, he didn't know, but he supposed it was practice. Well, of course, it was a good deal more than practice. It was a mixture of training, of observation, and of knowledge, and of feel for his task. And that is what people call luck with a commander. The commander who always guesses right. He doesn't really guess. It's a product of all those things, training and knowledge and observation and character. And that's how he gets the reputation of being a lucky commander. There's only one more point I'd make you about judgment, and that's this. The stronger a commander's willpower, the more dangerous or even fatal it may become if his judgment is bad. Therefore, when you select your commanders and when you train yourselves as commanders, keep the balance between strength of will and this judgment. Now, another power that a commander has got to have is flexibility of mind. Modern war and tactics and techniques change rapidly. Indeed, the whole background against which you fight a war may change very rapidly. The invention of a new weapon, a political change, a change in climate, the whole thing may change very quickly. And unless you can adapt yourself to that, unless your mind is sufficiently flexible, you won't be a good commander. What you've got to cultivate is imagination, but a controlled imagination, a flexibility of mind. And now, when I talk about flexibility of mind and strength of will, there is an obvious conflict between them. And you've got to be very careful to see that your strength of will doesn't become just damned obstinacy, and that your flexibility of mind doesn't become mere vacillation. We've all of us known the chap who went about thumping himself on the chest and saying, I'm a strong man, I don't change my mind. And there are two things about that. One is if he has to go about thumping himself on the chest and saying, I am a strong man, he's got a weakness somewhere. And the other thing is, of course, if he never changes his mind, he'll be wrong more often than he's right. And then you get the other fellow who has got such a flexible mind that he always agrees with the last chap who talked to him. And he's terrible. He's frightful. But you have somehow, in yourselves, in your own characters, to strike the balance between flexibility of mind and strength of will. And when you've done that, you'll be well on the road to being a commander in quite a big way. But nobody can help you very much in that. You've got to do that yourself. Another quality you've got to have is knowledge. Now, when you command a small unit, if you're a platoon commander, you ought to be able to do everything that you'll ask any man in that platoon to do rather better than he would himself. But when you get higher up and you command divisions and corps and armies and things, you can't, of course, be expected to perform all the operations that everybody under your command performs and have their technical skill. You can't take a wireless set to pieces and put it together again like a trained Remy chap ought to be able to do. You can't take out a fellow's appendix as well as a doctor would, though God knows I sometimes thought I could do better than some of them. But what you have got to know is you've got to know the capabilities of the machines that they handle. You've got to know the sort of conditions under which they've got to work. And you've got to know how long it takes them to do certain things. And you've got to have that kind of knowledge. Another kind of knowledge that you'd better get onto is the knowledge of your enemy. And we, the British, at any rate, are not very good at that. We don't study our enemy enough. And when you're a commander, one of the people you want to study very closely is your opposite number, the fellow you're fighting. Because very much a battle is a struggle between the wills of the commanders. And I found it very difficult to get very much information about the Japanese. We weren't very clever at it at the start of the war with Japan. And I remember on one occasion, I really did think I knew my opposite number pretty well. I used to keep his photo on my desk. He was an ugly-looking little basket with a big moustache and prominent teeth and glasses, just like a caricature of the Japanese. And if I couldn't do anything else, I used to look at him and say, well, I may not be much of a general, but anyway, I'm better looking than you. And I thought I knew that fellow very well. And I planned the whole campaign on what I reckoned he would do as a reaction. And it didn't go right at all. Everything went the other way. And it was only after I'd been fooling about at this game for some time that I discovered that they'd sent him off to commit suicide when he was told he could go home and commit suicide, but not till the war was over. And they'd produced another commander who had different ideas. But the whole temper of the thing was quite different because they'd changed the commander. And one of the things you've got to have knowledge of is your enemy, and especially the commander. Of course, major tactics will be the basis of your knowledge. But what I do stress, and what I think we the British, I won't say you do, although I think you do, what we miss very often is a general knowledge of administration. Now, it's not usually difficult for a commander to know what he wants to do. The thing that is difficult to know if he can do it with the resources he's got. And the answer to that is a logistical answer nearly always. And unless the commander himself has a pretty wide knowledge of general administration and logistics, he'll find himself much too much in the hands of his logistical experts, who will be admirable chaps, but who, as I said just now, will be on the cautious side. And I had a great argument with Field Marshal Montgomery. I don't have many because I nearly always agree with him on military matters. But I had a great argument with him once about what were the qualifications of a great commander. We each of us tried not to give our own qualifications, but... But I said, which rather surprised him, I said that I thought really the real test of a great commander in the field was to be a judge of administrative risk. A judge of administrative risk. You think that over. Now, if you've got those qualities that I've mentioned, willpower, judgment, flexibility of mind and knowledge, you'll be a commander. You'll be a good commander, you may even be a great commander. But you won't have necessarily the confidence of your men, especially when things are not going your own way. And the confidence of your men is essential. And in order to get that, all those qualities must be based in a simple honesty, on integrity. You've got to have this massive and simple honesty. All the really great commanders who held their men have had it. Because the only foundations that in a man himself will stand under real great stress are the moral ones. You're all right as long as you're winning. I'm a hell of a general when I'm winning. Anybody is. But it's when you're not winning. And I haven't always been winning. If you had ever been a British general at the start of a war, you'd know that. And it is then that there is the real test of leadership. It's a funny thing, you know, but when you're in command, and things have gone wrong, there always comes a pause when your men stop and they look at you. And they don't say anything, they just look at you. And it's rather an awful moment for the commander, because then he knows that their courage is ebbing out, their will is failing, and he's got to pull up out of himself the courage and the willpower that will pull those men up again and make them go on. That happens to every commander sometime or other. And he'll never get over it unless he's got the confidence of his men. I can remember myself, I'm not telling you this as an example of leadership, but I remember myself, I stepped out of a tank once because the tank was the only means of communication I'd got left. And I stepped out of it, and I saw waiting for me two of my subordinate commanders, a couple of staff officers, and one or two other fellows, standing in a very melancholy-looking group. And the situation was just about as bad as it could be. We got a division cut off. We had no means of getting it out. And I didn't think we should last very long, or it didn't look like it. And as I stepped out of this tank, those chaps just looked at me. And I didn't know what the hell to say. And so I put the best face I could on it, and I tried to look cheerful, and I said, well, gentlemen, it might be worse. And one of those unspeakable fellows said, how? And the only thing I could think of saying was, well, it might be raining. And damn me if in 2 hours it wasn't. Now, I don't hold that up to you as an example of leadership or how to deal with it, but it was a situation that I shall never forget. That feeling, and you will all have it. And what you've got to do is build yourself up for that time, because it'll come, and the way you'll survive it is by having the confidence of your men, which you will get by honesty in dealing and integrity. Now, to get on to the headquarters, which is the second phase in command. Headquarters is important as far as the commander himself is concerned, in its effect on him and in its effect on the people who are commanded. Now, I reckon that a commander has a right to demand from his headquarters two things. And the first is information, and the second is suggestions. Now, the information has got to cover a tremendously wide field. His own troops, the enemy, the topography, everything. And on it, he must form his judgment. Then I think it is the duty of his headquarters to put up to him suggestions for alternative courses of action, from which he selects, or he thinks of one for himself. Then, that is what he does for the headquarters should do for the commander. For the troops who are commanded, the first essential is that the headquarters should translate to them quickly and accurately the will of the commander. I suppose I've published dozens of operational instructions and orders, and I've never written one myself, because I've always had excellent staff officers who could do it. But there is one part of the order that I've always made a point of writing myself, and that is the object. And I do recommend it to you, gentlemen, that when long orders are being written about complicated operations, you take up your pen yourself and write the object in your own words, so that that object goes down to everybody. Now, your headquarters, you must insist, regards itself as the servant of the fighting troops. In practice, that means that they won't collect to themselves an undue proportion of the amenities, but they will confine themselves, or you will confine them,
to having the necessary degree of comfort for them to perform their duties really efficiently. In the Burma campaign, very often, owing to shortage of air transport, a lot of my troops, my forward formations, used to be on half rations. Whenever they went on half rations, I used to put my own headquarters on half rations. It was a little bit theatrical, I admit. But it did remind the young staff officers with healthy appetites what it was like to be hungry, and it perhaps made them put just a little more ginger into getting the supplies forward. But you have got to see that your headquarters is the servant of the fighting troops. It's got to be a friendly headquarters. I don't mean friendly amongst yourselves, it must be that, but it must be friendly to the people who come to it from outside. If you've got an officer who comes to headquarters to find out something, don't keep him hanging about. Have somebody ready to take him to the chap who can give him an answer. And don't forget that your headquarters, any headquarters, is always under inspection. Always. It's being inspected by the people who come up from below. Don't bother too much about the people who come down from above. It's the people who come up from below. And therefore, not only has your headquarters got to be a friendly one and a helpful one, but it's got to be not only efficient, but to look efficient. It's a very bad thing if you come up to a headquarters and it doesn't look efficient. It's got to look efficient. So take a look round yours and see that it does. Now, as far as the organization of your headquarters is concerned, we organize our headquarters now on the Chief of Staff system. So do you. Personally, I'm not very fond of it. I like the old-fashioned British system, before we began to copy Germans, of the commander dealing direct and himself with his principal staff officers. I know all the arguments in favor of the other, and they're very good ones. But if ever I run a thing, I run it rather on the old system. But don't let that worry you. I'm not preaching heresy. I'm not asking you to change anything. Because when you get to a height in command, it really won't matter what the theoretical organization of your headquarters is. By changing the emphasis a little bit, you'll have it running in the way you want it. There are certain officers in the selection of which for your headquarters you ought to pay a great deal of attention. There's first of all, of course, your Chief General Staff Officer, or your Chief of Staff. There's next, and in many ways more important, or equally important, your Chief Administrative Officer. And then there are two other fellows I would draw your attention to. And one is your Chief Intelligence Officer. Now, when you select your Chief Intelligence Officer, don't select him because he's the sort of fellow who can put on false whiskers and go down the bazaar and pass himself off as a Chinaman or something. Anyway, he can't do it, but you don't want that sort of fellow. What you want, first and foremost, is a good organizer. A fellow who can organize the collection and interpretation of intelligence, not necessarily collect it himself. And in his organization somewhere, you want a fellow who will represent to you the mind of the enemy commander. They're very hard to find, these chaps. Very hard to find. But they are there. They are very rarely regular officers. They are usually university dons or something like that. And they appear. And you get a fellow with the extraordinary flair of being able to put himself in the mind of the enemy commander. Well, get him and put him in your pocket, because he's very useful. And then you want some good planners. They also come from what we might sometimes think strange places. Two of the best planners I ever had, one was a fellow of All Souls College at Oxford, who was the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other one was an American National Guard reserve officer whose profession was the selling of refrigerators. And they were, both of them, absolutely first class. But you do want the high-class planner. Don't go in for traveling circuses. We developed a very bad habit in the British Army. When an officer was promoted, he took all his staff from the lower formation. Well, that meant that you pushed out a lot of really very good fellows. You broke up the command of a lower formation, and it wasn't good for the commander himself. Unless he was a very exceptional man, you were very much inclined to get a little too much Ludendorff and not enough Hindenburg. All British and all American headquarters are too big, and you want to cut them down. There are only, as far as I know, 3 ways of cutting down a headquarters. One is by a flat overall cut. You say you will reduce your staff by 10%. I do that about once a year to the War Office. And the excruciating noise of the corpse coming out of the bottles is heartbreaking. Another way of doing it is by the elimination of complete sections. And that is possible. Because you do find, especially in wartime, that round your headquarters grow up all sorts of fancy sections and things that you can really very well do without, or you can push further back. And then lastly, and a way which I recommend to your attention, is to cut out one complete tier of the staff hierarchy. Roughly speaking, say you get rid of all the captains and send them back to their regiments where they're very badly wanted. Or you get rid of all the majors and you let the captains do their own job and the major's job. And in a big headquarters, what you'll find is that in effect, that merely means that there's 1 note less on the file. And that's no harm. But unless you constantly keep your eye on the size of your headquarters, it'll grow out of all knowledge and usefulness. Now, the third and last element is the contact between the commander and his command. You can't, when you get a big formation, know more than a very small fraction of your men. But every man in your command, and I don't care how big it is, he ought to know you at least by sight. If you walk onto any parade or pass any men in your army, they ought to be able to say, there's the old bee, I wonder what he's up to now. You've got to be known to them. You've got to show yourself to your troops. And, of course, then there comes in this business of publicity. Now, I've hardly known a general in the British Army, and strangely enough in the American either, who hasn't said that he disliked publicity. And I have never yet seen a general in either army who didn't rush to the newspaper and see what it said about him. And publicity is with us, and it's here to stay, and it is necessary, and a good general uses it for his own purposes. I've only got one bit of advice about publicity to give you, and that is if you take over a large army or something, don't start outside publicity, at least until you are really thoroughly well known to your own men. And I suggest that you don't start it until you've won a battle or two, and then you won't have to bother, because it'll be done for you. But get yourself known to your own men before you start trying to get yourself known to people outside. Then the best way of getting yourself known to your own men is going about amongst them and actually talking to them. Now, if you want to talk to men, it doesn't matter whether they're private soldiers or staff officers or anybody. If you want to talk to them as a soldier and not as a ruddy politician, there are only 2 things necessary. The first is to have something to say that is worth saying, to know what you want to say. And the second, and terribly important thing, is to believe it yourself. Don't go and tell men something that you don't believe yourself, because they'll spot it, and if they don't spot it at the time, they'll damn soon find it out, and then you're finished. Don't go chasing scapegoats. If some fellow under your command has made a blob, has lost a battle, or done something that's wrong, don't rush off straight away and sack him. Some people think that's big stuff in the way of command. My advice to you is if a man loses a battle or gets a setback, go and see him and find out why. If he did it because he was careless, if he did it because he was stupid, or above all, if he did it because he'd got cold feet, sack him and tell him why you sacked him. But if he did it because he was a little bit overeager, because he took just a little bit too much risk, or for some reason of that kind, he's a little bit too pugnacious, give him another chance. Lots of fellows benefit a great deal by a little setback once. But the thing to do is to find out why. Don't be in too big a hurry to sack people. And if you have to sack anybody, which is the most unpleasant thing in the world, because the chaps you have to sack are usually rather nice people, do it yourself. Send for him, or go and see him, and do it straight to his face, and tell him why you've done it. And then push him straight out, put him in an airplane, send him right out of your army area. Don't leave it to other people to do it, and don't do it by letter. And similarly, if a rebuke has to be given to a subordinate commander, even a small one, sign it yourself. There's nothing more annoying if you're a major general than to get a raspberry signed Doolittle Captain. And finally, when, as some of you will, you become great generals, and you have all these fellows rushing about, the publicity merchants, watch it that they don't make a monkey of you. Watch it that they don't make you begin to act as they think you ought to act. If you see yourself putting your cap on at a particular slant in front of the mirror before you go out with all these fellows with their flash bulbs, well, just watch it. Because there have been more than one good chap who's been a little bit ruined by that, who's began to try and act up to what the publicity boys thought he ought to be. Well, don't. It may even affect your judgment. Now, I've talked quite long enough, a bit too long. And all I tell you is this, that command is a completely personal thing. That you've got to have certain essential qualities that I've mentioned: willpower, judgment, flexibility of mind, knowledge, and integrity. And don't confuse those with the frills that commanders always cultivate. They cultivate them because they want to get known to their troops. If you wear a couple of pearl-handled revolvers, you won't be a Patton. If you put 2 badges in a berry, you won't be Monty. But look at the essentials that are in those commanders and copy that. You've all got the makings of commanders in you. Some of you have already been commanders. You've all got the makings in you. You can develop them. You wouldn't be here in this hall if you hadn't. And the last thing I'd say to you is this: command is you. As you develop, be yourselves. Because no imitation was ever a masterpiece.